In 1976, the Soviet Union's most classified weapon was stolen. The thief was their own pilot. America paid $0 for it. His name was Viktor Belenko. And on September 6, 1976, he did something no one in the USSR thought possible. He flew the MiG-25 Foxbat, the world's fastest interceptor, straight into enemy hands. The crisis erupted at the Soviet Air Defense Command within the Far East Military District. Radar operators watched in disbelief as call sign Red 7, a MiG-25 Foxbat, abruptly broke formation. This wasn't a drift. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko turned his jet hard east, banking sharply toward Japan, pushing his engines past Mach 2. Red 7, you are off course. Acknowledge. Silence. Red 7, return to assigned heading immediately. Nothing. The shift commander's face went pale. This was no mechanical failure. Get me the base commander now. The base commander takes one look at the screen. Interceptors airborne? Negative, nothing in range. Scramble them. Sir, by the time they're up, he'll already be in international. Scramble them. Everyone in that room knows the math. The MiG-25 is already doing Mach 2, over 1,500 miles per hour. There's nothing close enough, nothing fast enough. The airwaves went dead. In Moscow, KGB headquarters erupted into chaos minutes later. The Americans had offered millions for this technology, and now it was flying toward them for free. As Belenko crossed into international airspace, he occupied a terrifying 30-minute window between total freedom and a fiery death. Soviet leaders faced an unthinkable calculus: shoot down their own prize asset or watch it land in enemy hands. They hesitated, and that hesitation cost them everything. How does a man plan an escape like this? Alone, under constant surveillance, without telling a single soul? The answer is more calculated than you'd expect. Keep watching. What happens next will surprise you. While the Soviet air defense scrambled to respond to the vanishing blip of Red 7, the true story of this defection was already months in the making. This was no impulsive act of madness. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculated planning executed by a man who knew that a single wrong word would lead to an immediate execution. To understand how Viktor Belenko achieved the impossible, one must first grasp the logistical nightmare of living under 24/7 KGB surveillance. Within the Soviet military, trust was a non-existent luxury. Informants were everywhere, among fellow pilots, ground crews, and even within one's own social circles. Belenko's escape was built on a foundation of absolute secrecy. His first challenge was the lack of intelligence. He had no outside help, no secret meetings with the CIA, and no hidden radio. He was entirely alone. His opening problem was timing. He spent months studying the flight schedules, waiting for a routine training mission that would place him near the coast without raising suspicion. He finally identified September 6, 1976, as his window. Perhaps the most difficult part was what he could not carry. Belenko knew that a physical map of Japan in the cockpit would be a death sentence if he were searched. Instead, he spent hundreds of hours memorizing the geography of northern Japan, the flight paths to South Korea, and the exact locations of civilian airfields like Hakodate, Sapporo, and Aomori. What came next required a level of emotional discipline that few humans possess. He told absolutely no one. This included his own wife and family. He knew the KGB monitored even the slightest hint of dissatisfaction, and any emotional departure would be flagged. So he attended every party meeting, followed every order with a smile, and played the part of a satisfied soldier day after day, week after week. The psychological strain of this double life was immense, yet Belenko never wavered, at least not outwardly. What went on inside the cockpit of his mind during those months, only he would later describe in fragments. The technical calculation was equally demanding. Using only the data available to him as a pilot, he calculated fuel ranges and the impact of prevailing winds over the Sea of Japan. He knew the MiG-25 consumed fuel at an alarming rate, especially at high speeds, and he had to balance the need for speed to evade interceptors with the need for range to reach land. On the morning of September 6th, he performed his pre-flight briefing as if it were any other day. He ate breakfast, filed his paperwork, and said nothing unusual. Then he climbed into the cockpit of the most classified weapon in the USSR. Belenko later recounted his preparations across multiple interviews. But the versions don't fully line up. Perhaps he refined the story over time. Perhaps memory under extreme pressure simply works differently. Either way, no one can verify it anymore. Viktor Belenko watched the Soviet coastline dissolve into the gray horizon of the Sea of Japan. But his triumph was short-lived. The MiG-25 was an engineering marvel, yet it possessed a fatal flaw. Its twin R-15 giant turbojets were thirsty monsters. At supersonic speeds, they didn't just burn fuel, they inhaled it. As he pushed toward Japan, the needle on his gauge began a steady, agonizing slide toward the red. He had stayed at maximum throttle for too long to evade the radar, and now the math in his head was turning grim. He was facing total fuel exhaustion over a dark, freezing ocean. The flight became a harrowing game of survival. Below him, the water looked like a jagged sheet of steel. If he ditched there, the aircraft and all its secrets would be lost forever. So would his life. He adjusted his trim, trying to find the most efficient glide ratio, but the weight of the Foxbat made it fly like a heavy brick. This was the moment where most pilots would have ejected, leaving the most classified weapon in the USSR to sink into the abyss. But Belenko was committed. He wasn't just flying for himself, he was carrying a puzzle that the West was desperate to solve. Suddenly, the Japanese coastline flickered into view through the haze. Hokkaido. He scanned the landscape desperately for anything flat. Then, he saw it. Hakodate Airport. It wasn't a sprawling military base. It was a modest civilian strip surrounded by houses and commercial buildings. The situation turned critical when his engine sputtered and died. The silence was deafening. He was now piloting a multi-ton glider. To make matters worse, a civilian Boeing 727 was currently taking off from the same runway. A detail that still sounds almost too cinematic to be true, yet the Japanese air traffic logs confirm it. Belenko had to bank sharply to avoid a mid-air collision, a move that drained the last of his precious momentum. He lined up for the approach, his hands tight on the stick. The MiG-25 slammed onto the Hakodate runway hard, the landing gear screaming as it absorbed the impact. He bounced once, then twice, before the drag chute deployed. He overshot the runway by 800 feet, plowing through a fence and coming to a halt in a cloud of dust and shredded rubber, just short of a major radar installation. Chaos erupted instantly. Passengers in the terminal stood frozen, staring through the glass at a gray, shark-like Soviet interceptor sitting in the dirt. This was unprecedented. Within minutes, Japanese police and airport security swarmed the site, sirens wailing. The first responders arrived with guns drawn, shouting orders Belenko couldn't understand. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and jet fuel. Belenko climbed out of the cockpit, his hands raised. In broken, practiced English, he uttered the words that would ignite a diplomatic firestorm.
I am Soviet pilot. I want asylum.
I want to go to the United States. The scene was a diplomatic nightmare in the making. Japanese air traffic controllers were in shock, grounding every civilian flight in the region as military officials raced to the scene. The immediate standoff between the local police and an armed foreign pilot on a civilian runway sent shockwaves through Tokyo and Moscow. This wasn't just a trespass, it was a heist conducted in broad daylight. As Belenko was led away into custody, the jet sat there, a silent puzzle. More than a plane, it was a window into Soviet engineering logic, but the autopsy would reveal a reality far stranger than anyone in the West had imagined. As Viktor Belenko was led away from the dusty Hakodate runway, the real battle of the Cold War began. Within 48 hours, a team of American aeronautical engineers arrived, tools in hand, ready to perform an autopsy on the most feared aircraft in the Soviet arsenal. For years, the MiG-25 Foxbat had been a ghost that haunted Western intelligence. It was the super weapon that forced the United States to develop the F-15 Eagle. But as the Americans began to pull the jet apart, the myth of Soviet technological supremacy evaporated, replaced by a reality that left the experts genuinely unsettled. The first revelation was the airframe. The West assumed the Foxbat was a titanium masterpiece, the only material capable of surviving the friction of Mach 3 flight. Instead, the engineers found themselves staring at common nickel steel. It was heavy, crude, and held together by visible, hand-welded rivets. The Soviets hadn't mastered titanium manufacturing on a mass scale, so they had simply used steel and compensated for the immense weight by bolting on the largest engines they could build. It was a sledgehammer approach to aerodynamics. Then came the electronics, and this is where the Americans almost laughed in disbelief. While the West was perfecting microchips and transistors, the MiG-25 was packed with vacuum tubes. To the Americans, this looked like 1950s museum technology. However, the mockery soon turned to a chilling realization of Soviet logic. Vacuum tubes are naturally immune to the electromagnetic pulses, EMP, generated by nuclear explosions. While an American jet's sensitive microchips would fry in the event of a nuclear exchange, the MiG-25 would remain fully operational. It was a machine built not for finesse, but for the end of the world. The autopsy documented everything through over 50,000 photographs and a total disassembly of the radar and weapon systems. They discovered that the MiG-25 wasn't actually a superior dogfighter at all. Its Mach 2.8 speed was a short burst capability. Sustained high speed would literally melt the engines. In fact, if Belenko had pushed the engines any harder, they would have been sucked into the intake as molten slag. Its range was terrible, with a 90-minute mission cap that made it useless for anything other than quick dashes. Its maneuverability was non-existent at high speeds. It had a turning radius the size of a small city. It was a dedicated interceptor designed for a single, brutal task: get up fast, fire at a target, and land. The truly unsettling part wasn't that the MiG-25 was weaker than believed. It was that the West had poured billions of dollars into countering a threat they never truly understood. After 2 months, Japan returned the MiG-25 to the Soviet Union, packed into crates like disassembled furniture. The secrets were gone. For Viktor Belenko, the return of the jet meant that the heavy price of his freedom was finally coming due. In the end, the MiG-25 was just a machine of steel and glass, but for Viktor Belenko, the flight never truly ended. While the United States celebrated a major intelligence windfall, the Soviet government ensured that the price of his freedom would be paid in isolation. Following the return of the Foxbat in those humiliating crates, Moscow shut its borders to Belenko's past. They refused to let his wife and son leave, transforming his defection into a life sentence of permanent separation. Viktor escaped the USSR alone, and he lived the rest of his life in America alone. A new identity in a new land, shadowed by the cost of his choice. The historical legacy of that 30-minute flight remains significant. By exposing the MiG-25 as a heavy, vacuum tube-driven interceptor rather than the invincible superweapon Western analysts feared, Belenko erased a decade of Soviet military mystique. This singular event forced a massive shift in Cold War power dynamics. It allowed the West to stop over-engineering its response to a phantom threat and fundamentally recalibrated air combat tactics for the remainder of the century. One man's calculated risk provided a clear window into Soviet engineering priorities, proving that technical limitations are often hidden behind a mask of propaganda. Viktor Belenko's story is a sobering reminder that while borders can be crossed and secrets can be stolen, the weight of freedom is often measured by what we are forced to leave behind. I first read about Belenko a few years ago, and the story stayed with me in a way I couldn't quite explain, not because of the aircraft, not because of the Cold War, but because of one small detail that most accounts leave out. That morning, he ate breakfast as usual, filed his paperwork, said nothing out of the ordinary, then climbed into the cockpit and flew away forever. I keep wondering, what did his face look like the last time he saw his wife? Had he practiced that expression for months, the same way he memorized every coordinate on the mental map in his head? And if so, which is heavier? The loneliness of a man living in secret, or the loneliness of a man who escaped but couldn't take anyone with him? There's a paradox at the center of this story that I think most people miss. The West celebrated because they discovered the MiG-25 was weaker than feared. Good news, strategically. But for the Soviet Union, the opposite was also true in its own way. They had built something that kept the entire world afraid for years without it ever needing to be perfect. It only needed to look perfect. Propaganda, it turns out, is also a weapon, and it costs a lot less than titanium. Belenko passed away in 2024 at 76 in the United States. He lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse, his ex-wife remarry, and the son he never saw again grow up as a stranger. I don't know if he made peace with any of that, but I think that's the real question at the heart of this story. Not whether the aircraft lived up to the fear, but this: a man who gave up everything for freedom, then spent the rest of his life living with the cost of that choice. Did he consider it a victory? I don't have an answer, and I suspect Belenko didn't either. If you know anything more about him, or see this story differently, I'd genuinely like to hear it. If this story stayed with you, a like is the quickest way to let us know. And subscribe so we have a reason to keep telling stories like this. Thank you.